Good morning, Laila. It is St. Patrick's Day, and so I've got on my green, and I got a little purple and gold on too for Mardi Gras. But I am sitting out. Look how sunny it is. I'm on my patio, and I'm sitting out here. I've got my reading friends, helpers, Porter and Penny, but they want to sunbathe instead of joining for the Goone Bird Greene story. And so I wanted to read chapter 3 to you because it sounds like you're really enjoying the adventures of Goone Bird Greene. And I thought maybe you liked the picture book so you could see the pictures instead of me. But your mom told me that you really enjoy seeing weird Miss Becca. So today you get to stare at my face while I read. Oh, and if you're hearing the sound effects, Kitty came to visit. His name is Golden Colorado. So he's here to visit. He might climb on my lap, just so you know. All right, let me get into my reading voice. We need to come up with a fun name for this show. It's like book time with Becca and Laila. I don't know. We might need to come up with a name for this show and keep on doing it. Maybe when you're home, you and I can sit together and read books and post them to YouTube. Chapter 3, Goone Bird Greene by Lois Lowry. On Friday, Goone Bird was wearing capri pants, a satin tank top, and a long string of pearls. So maybe my necklace was fitting dress up for reading this today. So she's wearing a long string of pearls. Her red hair was twisted into one long braid, which was decorated with plastic flowers. There were flip-flops on her feet. "You look beautiful," Kiko said to Goone Bird in an admiring whisper. So she said, "You look beautiful," Kiko said to Goone Bird in an admiring whisper. "Yes, I know," Goone Bird replied. "Thank you, Kiko." She walked to the front of the classroom when Miss Pigeon told her that it was time. Here's a little illustration. Malcolm was back in the classroom. He was at his desk writing, "I will never put anything in my nose," 100 times on a piece of lined paper. The nurse had told him to do that. She said it would keep his hands busy and away from his nose. "How come Goone Bird gets to go stand in front of the class?" Malcolm asked. "Shh," everybody except Felicia Ann said to Malcolm. "Just listen." "Today," Goone Bird said, "I have a very exciting story to tell you. And in my story, there is a long journey, a mystery, and a rescue." Miss Pigeon, seated at her desk, had begun correcting some spelling papers. She looked up. "Listen, second grader," she said. "Hear the different things that Goone Bird is putting in her story. That is what good storytellers do." Goone Bird listened patiently to the teacher. Then she stood up straight and did some breathing exercises. Hold on. Porter's attacking Golden, Colorado. Porter! No, you come here and sit with Mom. Come here. Now, come here. Come here now. Come. Come. Jump up. Come on. Jump up. Come here now. Come. Come. Okay. Porter's going to be part of the story today so that he doesn't attack the kitty because he's having a rough time since I've been gone so much. And I think he knows the suitcases are back out because we're leaving to go skiing in Colorado with Grandma and Grandpa. Okay, back to our story. Sorry for the interruption. I did not want to re-record the other part of the story, so we're just carrying on. Goone Bird listened patiently to the teacher, and then she stood up straight, did her breathing exercises, and finally she took a very deep breath, looked at the class. "I am ready to begin," she said at last. The title of the story for today will be How Goone Bird Came from China Flying on a Flying Carpet. "Just like Aladdin," Barry Tuckerman said in a very loud whisper. "Just like Aladdin." "Barry, pay attention, please," Goone Bird said. "I'd like to have absolutely all eyes on me." Then, when the class became silent, all except Felicia Ann, who had been silent all along, and almost all eyes, even Miss Pigeon's, were on her, Goone Bird began. How Goone Bird Came from China on a Flying Carpet by Goone Bird Greene. Once upon a time, just last month, Mr. and Mrs. Greene decided to take their little girl, Goone Bird, and move away from the place where they had always lived. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Greene had a new job, and his new job was in Water Tower. "That's here," Chelsea said aloud. "I live in Water Tower." Goone Bird stopped talking. She arranged her pearl necklace so that it was draped over one shoulder. "Me too," Tricia said. "We all live in Water Tower," Ben pointed out. "That's why we go to Water Tower Elementary School." "Class," Miss Pigeon warned. "Miss Pigeon," Goone Bird said politely, "let me take care of this." "Children," she said in a firm voice, "I cannot tell a story if I am constantly interrupted. There will be time for questions and comments, so please raise your hand if you want to say something. It is very distracting to me if you call out." "Sorry," said Tricia. "Sorry," Chelsea said. "Sorry," Ben added in a whisper. The class waited. Goone Bird looked at them all sternly, and then she did some breathing exercises again and began again. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Greene had a new job, and his new job was in Water Tower. So they packed carefully. It took many days. First, Mr. Greene had to pack 43 sets of false teeth. Then Mrs. Greene had to pack her dancing shoes and her bathing suits, and Goone Bird had to pack all of her belongings, which included a money collection. And finally, their furniture was loaded into a moving van, and the Greene family waved goodbye as the moving van drove away from China, and it started its journey to Water Tower. Goone Bird stopped. Every child in the classroom had raised their hand, and even Miss Pigeon was waving her arm. "I'll have an intermission now for questions," Goone Bird said. "Chelsea, your question first, please." "Why did Mr. Greene have 43 pairs of false teeth?" Chelsea asked. "The false teeth are not part of this story," Goone Bird said, and moved on. "Malcolm?" Malcolm had looked up from his "I will not put anything in my nose" paper. His eyes were very wide. "Tell me about the money collection." "That's another story," Goone Bird said. "Beanie, your question? When are you going to tell about the prince and the diamonds?" Beanie asked. Goone Bird thought it over for a minute. "On Monday, I'll tell you about it," she said. "Now, there's time for one more question before I continue. Miss Pigeon, did you have your hand raised?" Miss Pigeon nodded. "Goone Bird," she said in a very nice voice, "you have an amazing imagination, and we think you are wonderful at telling stories. Don't we, class?" She looked around, and almost all of the children were nodding. "But I want to be certain that the children understand that these are made-up stories. So I want to point out my stories are absolutely true," Goone Bird said. "Well, I want to point out," Miss Pigeon went on, "that of course we all know that China is a foreign country across the ocean, and that a moving van could never drive from China to Water Tower." Goone Bird rearranged her pearls. She sighed. "Miss Pigeon, why don't we take a few minutes for research? Is there an atlas in the bookcase?" Miss Pigeon laughed and said, "Of course." So she went to the bookcase, took out a book of maps called an atlas. "Now," said Goone Bird, "would you find out if there are other Chinas?" "Other Chinas? I don't think." Miss Pigeon began turning the pages of the atlas. She found the index in the back. "My goodness," Miss Pigeon said after a minute. "There's a China in Texas." "Correct," said Goone Bird. "And what else?" "There's a China in Maine." "Correct," said Goone Bird. "And?" "California. There's a China Lake. Oh my goodness, and look, in North Carolina." "And now it is time to continue the story," Goone Bird announced. Where were we? Oh yes, I remember now. The moving van had just left China, and she looked up and began the story. After the moving van left China, the Greene family loaded up the station wagon with 5 big suitcases, and then they added a lawnmower that they had forgotten to put in the moving van, a cooler full of ham sandwiches, and iced tea, and a bundled up stack of National Geographics, and an orange and white cat named Catman. Number 1. Thoughts from Miss Becca. Catman is a really cool cat name. Number 2 thought from Miss Becca. I love the National Geographic, Laila, so maybe when you get home, I can bring over and read some of my National Geographic magazines. Okay, back to the story. An orange and white cat named Catman, who had no tail because he had flicked his former tail once under the lawnmower. The last thing they put into the station wagon was a rolled-up rug from the front porch of their house. It was too long to fit. They tried it sideways and they folded it and upside down, but it still would not fit. Let's leave it behind, Mr. Greene suggested, but Mrs. Greene began to cry. It was my mother, she said. There's a stain on it where my mother spilled some black bean soup 40 years ago. I feel sentimental about this rug. So Mr. Greene agreed to take the rug because it made him cry too. If his wife cried, he decided to put back... Oh, it made him cry too if his wife cried. He decided to put the back window of the station wagon down so that the end of the rolled-up rug could stick out. He made certain that everything was nicely arranged and that Catman had a comfortable place to sleep on the back seat, just beneath the end of the rug and next to the place where Goone Bird would sit. Mr. Greene and Mrs. Greene and Goone Bird all got into the car and drove away from China, starting their long journey to Water Tower. They drove for many, many hours. They ate all of the ham sandwiches and drank all of the iced tea. They stopped to get gas. They went to the bathroom. They played the car radio. They listened to the news. They listened to opera and football games and talk shows about love, relationships. And suddenly, Goone Bird glanced down and noticed with dismay that her beloved Catman had disappeared. She looked around the floor of the back seat, but Catman was not there. She heard a small sound like a purr coming from inside the rolled-up rug. She knew that Catman had entered the rug. He probably found it a warm and dark and cozy place. But Goone Bird was worried about Catman. She decided to try to get him out. She reached into the rolled-up center of the rug, but he slithered away beyond her hands. She looked at the back of her parents' heads, wondering if she should tell them about the problem with Catman. But her mother was dozing off to sleep, and her father was driving and watching the road carefully and listening to a radio program about whales. So Goone Bird decided to wiggle into the rug herself to rescue Catman. Oh, no, Kiko cried from her seat. I'm going to faint. Shh, the other children said. It was dark and dusty. It was dark and dusty and very tight squeeze inside of the rolled-up rug, but Goone Bird wiggled inch by inch toward Catman. Catman slithered away, inch by inch. She could see his glittering eyes as he backed away from her hands. Goone Bird was determined to rescue him. She continued forward. Suddenly, an amazing thing happened. Even though Goone Bird was not very large and did not weigh very much, and was not wearing her heavy diamond earrings from the palace that day, her weight made the rolled-up rug start to tilt. At that very moment, Mr. Greene leaned forward to change the radio station in the car, went over a pothole on the road, and the rolled-up rug containing both Catman and Goone Bird slid out of the back of the station wagon and flew through the air before it landed at the side of the road in some thick grass beside a fence post. A cow chewing a purple flower looked up curiously and then wandered away. The station wagon drove on around a curve in the road, and slowly the rug unrolled. Catman's fur was standing on end, as if if he had a tail, it would have been sticking straight up in the air. For a moment, Catman stood still, looking at Goone Bird, and then he ran away very fast. Goone Bird sat up. She was not entirely sure what had exactly happened, but she was not hurt. She simply wondered where her family was, and her cat, and her car. Other cars stopped and people got out. Many people offered her a drink of water from their bottles of Evian. Evian's a type of fancy water, Laila. I did not know what that was until I went to Hawaii when I was a little girl in high school, and everyone drank Evian water. Back to the story. But Goone Bird wasn't thirsty, and after a while, a policeman with a flashing light came. A TV reporter came and a cameraman. And while the policeman talked on his radio, the TV reporter, a woman with very large hair, interviewed Goone Bird and called her the little girl who had a flying carpet ride. In the interview, Goone Bird Greene described Catman and asked people to call the station if they found him, but she never got Catman back. Eventually, the police car took her to her parents, who were both crying at the gas station 4 miles down the road. And when Goone Bird and her parents were finally reunited, everyone, including 2 policemen, a TV reporter, and the gas station owner, hugged and kissed and did the tango. The end. The tango is a type of dance, Laila, that they do down in South America, I believe. What a lovely story, Miss Pigeon said, and a very exciting one, too, but a little bit sad to lose your kitty that way. Well, Catman is not a kitty, Goone Bird said. He is a cat, and I didn't say that I lost him. I just said that I never got him back. So no one found him and called the TV station? Actually, they did, Goone Bird replied. But where's Catman now? Asked Miss Pigeon. He was consumed by a cow, Goone Bird said. But that's a different story for a different day. By a cow? You're joking, Mrs. Pigeon said. Nope, said Goone Bird. I'm not joking. I tell only absolutely true stories. Tell it, tell it, tell it, please, the children called. I will, Goone Bird said. Another day. That's the end of chapter 3, Laila. I hope you have a great St. Patrick's Day. I hope that you keep getting strong, stay fierce and feisty. You are full of vinegar, little girl, and I want you to get healthy and get out of the hospital and get home real soon, because we are going to have more time reading, and we're going to have a 2-2 tea party. Promise? Promise.